Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Hi everyone, welcome you to this second lecture on labor supply. If you recall the last lecture, the optimal consumption of goods and leisure for the worker is given by the point where the budget line is tangent to the indifference curve. This type of solution is called an interior solution because the worker is not at either corner of this opportunity set. So, the point P on this graph you can see is an interior solution. And having at point P, the worker chooses $500 of consumption and 40 hours of work in the labor market. So, as compared to point Y and which is not attainable, at point P which is the worker is at a low utility function, point P is the best solution for him. Now, what are the factors that can bring changes to this decision of hours of work that he decides he should work? By working 40 hours, he can maximize his utility. Mostly the factors that can affect this decision of hours of work can come from the changes in the non-labor income and the changes in the wage rate. Let us try to understand what is going to happen when there is a change happens to the non-labor income, keeping the wage rate constant. Now, you can see in this graph with the endowment point at point E0, which means the worker is having the non-labor income $100 with the wage rate $10. The worker is having a budget line F0 E0 and the worker maximize his utility on this U0 having the point at P0, which decides that the worker will have 40 hours of work. Now, let us say if the non-labor income increases from 100 to $200, the worker is now moving from this point, endowment point is now moving from point E0 to point E1. Having the wage rate same, the slope of this budget line will be the same and the worker is now having a new budget line which is F1 E1. So, definitely the opportunity set of the worker has increased just because of the increase in his non-labor income. Now, you can see the worker is having a new tangency point at point P1 with this utility function U1, which means now the worker is consuming 80 hours of leisure and this is the level of consumption. So, both C and L are going to increase, consumption of both C and L is going to increase by increase in this non-labor income from E0 to E1. If you look at this graph and this, the same non-labor income has increased from 100 to 200 Now the endowment point has increased from point E to point E1. The opportunity set has increased from F0 E0 to F1 E1, and the tangency point has moved from P0 to P1. Now what happens? In this case, the leisure hour has reduced to 60. There is a decrease in the leisure hour, but there is the increase in the consumption. So if you compare these two panels, these two situations, panel A, you can see the leisure hour has increased from 70 to 80. In panel B, the leisure hour has decreased from 70 to 60. On the contrary, if you see, the work hour has decreased for this panel A, the work hour has increased for this panel B. Now we are having a set of contradictory results when there is an increase in the non-labor income. The impact of the changes in the non-labor income holding the wage constant on the number of hours work is called the income effect. Now why we are having these contradictory results? Both the panels in the figure draw legal indifference curves. Both panels have indifference curves that are downward sloping, they do not intersect, and they are convex to origin. It seems that we cannot predict how an increase in the non-labor income affects the hours of work, because in one case it is increasing, in another case it is decreasing. To predict this, in which way it will affect, we have to make an additional restriction on the shape of the indifference curve. The additional restriction we make is that leisure is a normal good as opposed to leisure being an inferior good. So what is a normal good? What is an inferior good? We define a commodity to be normal good when increase in income holding the price of all goods constant increase its consumption, whereas a commodity is an inferior good when increase in income holding prices constant decreases its consumption. Now if we think on whether leisure is a normal or an inferior good, most of us would probably reach to the conclusion that leisure activities are normal good. Put it differently, if we are wealthier, we would surely demand a lot of leisure. We could then visit Aspen in December, Rio in February, exotic beaches in South Pacific in summer, because it seems reasonable to assume that leisure is a normal good, and because there is some evidence supporting this assumption, our decision will focus on this case is the assumption that leisure is a normal good. If we assume this, that leisure is a normal good, it will resolve the conflict between these two panels in the favor of panel A, which means as an increase in non-labor income, then there will be a rise in the demand for leisure hours, and therefore it will reduce the hours of work. So the income effect which happens due to the change in the non-labor income implies that an increase in non-labor income holding the wage rate constant reduces the work hour. Now let us try to understand what happens to the work hour, hours of work decision when the wage changes. Consider a wage increase from $10 to $20 an hour, holding the non-labor income constant. Let us try to understand what is going to happen. If you look at this graph, with the initial non-labor income B, the endowment point is E, and having a wage rate 10, the workers opportunity set or the budget line is FE, and the worker is initially at a point of equilibrium at point P, where he maximizes his utility by working 40 hours or having 70 hours of leisure. Now, the wage has increased from 10 to 20. So, the budget line will move around this point, endowment point E. Now, the budget line, new budget line is GE. Now, because of the change in the wage rate, the opportunity set has shifted, has increased, and the worker is having the utility function which maximizes at this budget line is U1 and at the point R. Now, if you compare these 2 points, point P and point R, earlier the worker was working for 70 hours, worker was having the leisure of 70 hours, now the worker is having the leisure of 75 hours, which means it has increased the leisure hour. Let me give you another situation. In this situation, the same effect, the worker's wage rate has increased from 10 to 20, so as his opportunity set has increased from EF to EG, and the worker has moved from the point P to point R while maximizing his satisfaction by consuming both leisure and work. Now, what is happening when you compare with these 2 points, point P and point R? Earlier the worker was consuming 70 hours of leisure and having 40 hours of work. Now, at point R, the worker is having 65 hours of leisure and 45 hours of work, which means the work hour has increased, the leisure hour has decreased. So, when we compare these two situations in panel A, the leisure hour has increased due to the change in the wage. The work in panel B, the leisure hour has reduced due to the increase in the wage rate. So, a wage increase moves the worker from point P to point R can either decrease or increase the hours of work. We are having a contradictory result, and there is certain ambiguity in the effects of changes in the wage rate on the work hours. The reason for the ambiguity in the relation between hours of work and the wage rate is of fundamental importance, which introduces a set of tools and ideas that plays a central role in all economics. Both the panels in the figure show that regardless of what happens to the hours of work, a wage increase expands workers' opportunity set. If we put it differently, we can say that a worker has more opportunities when she makes 20 hours, $20 an hour than when she makes $10 an hour. We know that an increase in the income increases the demand for all normal goods, including leisure. So, the increase in the wage increases the demand for leisure, which reduces the hours of work. in panel A. But this is not all that happens. The wage increase also makes leisure more expensive. When the worker earns $20 an hour, she gives up $20 every time she decides to take an hour off from his work. Therefore, the leisure time is very expensive commodity for the high wage workers and a relatively cheap commodity for the low wage workers. Therefore, high wage workers have strong incentive to cut back on their consumption of leisure activities. A wage increase thus reduces the demand for leisure and increases the work hour, as we have seen it in the figure panel B. So, this discussion highlights the essential reason for the ambiguity in relation between hours of work and the wage rate. A high wage worker wants to enjoy the rewards of her high income, therefore, would like to consume more leisure. However, the same worker finds that leisure is very expensive and simply cannot afford to take time off from the work. So, there is two conflicting forces which works. One is to consume more leisure, another is the same time he cannot afford to lose. So, how these two conflicting forces work, we can discuss it through the help of the graph. Now, what happens when there is a wage changes happens, which leads to increase in the worker's income and raises the price of leisure. Now, when the wage rate was 10, the opportunity set or the budget line was EF, the worker was at point P having 70 hours of leisure. Now, the wage rate has increased from 10 to 20, the worker is having a new opportunity set, the budget line has shifted up, which is now GE, and the worker is having the utility function U1 at point R, the equilibrium condition gets satisfied, the utility maximizing condition gets satisfied. Now, the worker is having 75 hours of leisure. So, simultaneously both the things work. His income has increased as well as he finds the leisure is more expensive. So, he cannot substitute with work hour, he finds difficulty. So, moving from point P to point R is having two effects simultaneously. One is the income effect, another one is the substitution effect. Let us try to find out how much is due to the substitution effect and how much is due to the income effect. When the wages has increased from 10 to 20, let us isolate this income effect. So, to isolate this income effect, we have drawn a parallel line D dash to this F E, this budget constant, switch tangent the utility function at point Q on this U1 utility function. Now, when we isolate this, how much is due to the change in the income due to change in the wage rate? As the income increases from 10 to 20, the worker should have consumed the leisure of 85 hours, but simultaneously he finds that the leisure is very expensive. to do the trade off. So, he substitutes work, substitutes consumption with the leisure. So, he moves along with the same utility function towards up, where he finds at point R. So, moving from P to R is through Q. So, P to Q is the income effect, Q to R is the substitution effect. Now, he finds that the way leisure is very expensive to substitute. Now, he moves towards this side and finds that he should consume 75 hours of leisure. So, moving from 70 to 85 is the income effect, and moving from 85 to 75 is the substitution effect. So, the net result, we find that there is an increase in the leisure hour. In this case, the income effect dominates this substitution effect. The move from initial position P to the final position R can be decomposed into a first stage move from P to Q and a second stage move from Q to R. As I said, moving from P to Q is an income effect, and the move from P to Q arises from the changes in the worker's income holding the wage constant. The income effect isolates the changes in the consumption bundle induced by the additional income generated by the increase in wage. Because both leisure and goods are normal goods, the point Q must lie towards the northeast point of P, so that more is consumed of both goods and leisure. Therefore, the income effect increases the demand for leisure from 70 to 85 hours and reduces the work hour by 15 hours per week. The second stage, moving from Q to R, is called the substitution effect. It shows what happens to the worker's consumption bundle as the wage increases, holding the utility constant, moving on the same utility function. Moving along on that same indifference curve, the worker's utility or the real income held fixed. The substitution effect therefore isolates the impact of increase in the price of leisure on the hours of work, holding the real income constant. So, the move from Q to R shows a substitution away from the leisure towards the consumption of other goods. In other words, we can say that as wages rises, the worker devotes less time to expensive leisure activities. So, he moves from 85 hours of leisure to 75 hours of leisure and increases her consumption. Therefore, through the substitution effect, the wage increases. As the wage increases, it reduces the demand for leisure and increases the hours of work by 10 hours. So, the substitution effect implies that an increase in the wage rate holding the real income constant increases the hours of work. As you can see in that figure in panel A, the decrease in the hours of work generated by income effect, which is 10 hours, exceeds the increase in the hours of work associated with the substitution effect of 10 hours. So, in this case, in the panel A, the stronger income effect leads to a negative relationship between hours of work and the wage rate. What will happen if these two effects work in the opposite direction? That is the situation in the panel B. Now, moving from point P to point R happens through point Q. So, earlier at the initial stage, the worker is at equilibrium at point P, maximizing his utility at point P. Now he moved, as after his increase in the wage rate from 10 to 20, he moves from P to R. This happens through point Q. So, moving from point P to Q is the income effect. So, in this case, the income effect increases the leisure hour by 10 hours. However, in this case, you can see there is a strong substitution effect moving from point Q to point R. The substitution effect leads to a decrease in the leisure hour by 15 hours. So, net effect you can see there is a decrease in the leisure hour or there is an increase in the work hour. So, the reason for this ambiguity in the relationship between hours of work and the wage rate should now be clear. As the wage rises, a worker faces a larger opportunity set and the income effect increases a demand for leisure and decreases the labor supply. However, as wage rises, leisure becomes more expensive and the substitution effect generates incentives for that worker to switch away from the leisure and instead consume more goods. So, this shift frees of leisure hours and thus increases the hours of work. So, when we compare these two panels and we are getting contradictory results, in panel A, the income effect dominates over the substitution effect, whereas in the panel B, the substitution effect dominates over the income effect. As a result, in panel A, you can see an increase in the wage rate decreases the hours of work, whereas in panel B, an increase in the wage rate decreases the hours of leisure or increases the hours of work. Our analysis of the relationship between this non-labor income, the wage rate and hours of work assumed that the person worked both before and after the changes in the non-labor income or the wages. So, the person is already in the labor market, he is employed. So, the hours of work then adjusted to the changes in the opportunity set. But it is important to understand that what factors motivate a person to enter the labor force in the first place. So, the decision to take that whether to work or not to work. Let us try to understand that how an individual take a decision whether to enter into the labor market, whether to work or whether not to work. So, in this graph, we are trying to explain the behavior of the individual, how he take a decision that whether he should work or he should not work. Let us say the individual is having some amount of non-labor income. So, he is at the point of this endowment point, point E. At this endowment point, if the worker is not working at all, he is having some utility, he enjoys U0 amount of utility. So, the indifference curve for him intersects at this point of this endowment point. So, worker finds the utility of U0 amount having leisure hour for T hours. So, if he is not working, he also having some amount of utility, that is U0. Now, let us say if the wage rate is WL, a low wage rate WL. With a WL wage rate, the worker is having the opportunity set GE. Now, if you see, if the worker is going to get some kind of satisfaction or some kind of utility or move away from this point E towards on any point on this opportunity set, let us say point X. So, what is happening at point X? He is having a utility function which is UG, which is lower than this UO. So, with a low wage rate, if the worker is entering into the labor market or having the utility UG, he is not better off as compared to the point E. If you compare the point X and point E, the worker is better off at point E, because operating at any point on this opportunity set, let us say for example X, puts him on a lower indifference curve. So, he will not prefer to operate at point X. Now, let us say a wage rate which is much higher, a high wage rate WH. So, with a high wage rate WH, the worker's opportunity set is HE, and the worker finds his utility maximizing point at point Y, operating at a higher utility function UH. So, if we compare between this Y and E, definitely the worker is at better off by operating at point Y. So, the question here is that what makes the worker to move towards the labor market from his endowment point. So, there is a difference which bribes the worker between these two wage rates WL and WH, low wage and high wage. This difference is the called the reservation wage, the wage at which the minimum increase in the income that would make the person indifferent between remaining at the endowment point E and working that the first hour. So, the reservation wage is the wage which attracts the worker to enter into the labor market or to decide that whether to work or not to work. That is nothing but the slope of the indifference curve, the absolute slope of the indifference curve at the point E. So, the definition of this reservation wage implies that the person will not work at all if the market wage is less than the reservation wage, and the person will enter the labor market if the market wage exceeds the reservation wage. Therefore, the decisions to work is based on a comparison of the market wage, which indicates that how much of employer are willing to pay for an hour of work, and the reservation wage, which indicates how much of the worker requires to be bribed into working for that first hour. So, the theory implies that a high reservation wage makes less likely that a person will work. Each individuals are having their reservation wage. So, if the reservation wage for the individual is high, so it is less likely that the worker will work at a low market wage rate. So, holding the reservation wage constant, the theory implies that high wage persons are more likely to work. The theory also predicts a positive relationship between the person's wage rate and her probability of working. However, it contrasts the strong prediction with our earlier results that a wage increase has a theoretical ambiguous effect on hours of work, depending on whether the income or substitution effect dominates. What is the difference in this theory is that the difference between these two results arises because an increase in the wage generates an income effect only if the worker is working. An increase in the wage of a non-worker therefore does not generate an income effect. The wage increase implies simply makes leisure income more expensive and hence is likely to draw non-workers into the labor market. So, any increase in the wage rate will lead to attract a person who is not a part of the labor market, who is not working. So, it will attract to the non-worker into the labor force. In the next lecture, we will discuss about the labor supply, how we will derive the labor supply curve of an individual. We will measure the elasticity and we will discuss the implications of this elasticity of labor supply. Thank you.